Commander Zixithera stepped off the transport ship and onto Crossroads 7 with the measured pace of someone who had seen too much war. His scaled feet clicked against the metal floor as he walked through the docking bay. Other beings moved out of his way without being asked. They could tell from his scarred hide and the way he carried himself that this was not someone to bother. The trading station buzzed with activity. Merchants from dozens of worlds hawked their goods. Pilots shared stories over drinks. Diplomats whispered deals in dark corners. But Zixithera had no interest in any of it. He only wanted supplies and a quiet place to rest before his next assignment. His reptilian eyes scanned the crowd as he walked. After fighting in over 1,000 battles, he could spot trouble from across a room. Pirates trying to look like honest traders, smugglers nervous about their cargo, soldiers pretending to be on leave. But today everything seemed normal. Just another day at the crossroads of space. Zixithera found the supply depot and placed his orders. Food, ammunition, fuel cells, medical supplies, the same things he always needed. The clerk, a small furry creature from the Gamma sector, processed his request with shaking hands. Even here, far from any battlefield, his reputation followed him. Commander Zixithera of the Vorthak Empire, the clerk whispered to his assistant. They say he has never lost a battle. It was true, though Zixithera took no pride in it. Victory was simply what happened when you planned better than your enemy, when you calculated odds, managed resources, and made the hard choices that others could not make. War was mathematics. The side with better numbers usually won. With his business finished, Zixithera walked through the station's main corridor. He had 6 hours before his supplies would be ready. 6 hours to rest his mind before returning to the endless cycle of conflict that had defined his life for the past millennium. The cantina caught his attention, not because he was thirsty, but because it was quiet. Most of the other establishments on the station were loud and crowded. But this place seemed different, older, more settled, the kind of place where a warrior could sit in peace. He pushed through the door and found himself in a dimly lit room filled with beings from across the galaxy. The air smelled of alien spices and recycled atmosphere. Conversations hummed at low levels. Perfect Zixithera chose a table in the corner where he could watch the room. Old habits. Even in a neutral station, it paid to be careful. He ordered a drink from a robotic server and settled back to observe. That was when he heard her voice. So there I was, facing down 3 Zephyrian battle cruisers with nothing but a damaged frigate and a crew that hadn't slept in 36 hours. The voice belonged to a human female sitting at the bar. She was older, with gray hair and lines on her face that spoke of hard years. Her clothes were practical, the kind worn by spacers and traders. But something about the way she sat, the way she held herself, reminded Zixithera of career soldiers he had known. Humans were a relatively new species in galactic politics. Their technology was decent but not remarkable. Their military was small compared to the great powers. Most established races saw them as minor players in the grand scheme of things. Zixithera had fought alongside human units a few times. They were adequate soldiers, though prone to emotional decision-making that often got them into trouble. The smart thing would have been to run, the human woman continued. Any reasonable commander would have jumped to hyperspace and lived to fight another day. But we couldn't do that. A small crowd had gathered around her, different species, all listening with interest. Even the bartender, a massive being with 4 arms, had stopped polishing glasses to pay attention. Why not? Asked a young pilot from somewhere in the outer rim. The woman smiled, but there was sadness in it. Because there was a civilian transport behind us. 3,000 colonists, including families with children. If we ran, those battle cruisers would have torn them apart. Zixithera found himself listening despite his intention to ignore the conversation. The tactical situation the human described was simple. 1 damaged ship against 3 healthy ones with non-combatants to protect. Any competent commander would see only one logical choice. So what did you do? Another listener asked. We bought them time, the woman said simply. 37 minutes of the fiercest fighting you ever saw. We threw everything we had at those Zephyrian ships. Torpedoes, missiles, even launched our shuttle as a guided bomb. My crew knew we probably weren't going home, but nobody complained. Nobody suggested we should run. Zixithera's scaled brow furrowed. This made no tactical sense. Trading 1 military vessel for civilian lives was economically inefficient. The frigate and its crew were trained resources that took years to replace. The civilians, while regrettable losses, were ultimately replaceable. Did the transport escape? Someone asked. They did, the woman nodded. Made it to hyperspace with 12 seconds to spare. As for us? Well, let's just say the Zephyrians learned that humans don't die easy. We took 2 of their ships with us before they finally got our reactor. The crowd murmured appreciation, but Zixathara felt only confusion. Why were they celebrating what was clearly a defeat? The human had lost her ship, lost her crew, accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. It was waste on a scale that offended his military sensibilities. How did you survive? A young engineer asked. The woman, who had introduced herself as Captain Elena Rodriguez, touched a scar on her neck. Emergency pod. The Zephyrians picked me up after the battle. Spent 2 years in their prison camps before the war ended. But that's a different story. As the evening wore on, Elena told more tales, stories of human military actions that made Zixathara's tactical mind recoil in horror. Soldiers charging machine gun nests when flanking was impossible. Ships ramming enemy vessels instead of retreating. Ground forces holding positions that could not be held, buying time for evacuations or reinforcements. Each story followed the same pattern. Humans faced with impossible odds choosing to fight anyway, usually dying in the process. And somehow impossibly these defeats had become legends in human culture. They celebrated their losses as much as their victories. Zixathara had commanded fleets in battles across 17 sectors. He had studied the military traditions of hundreds of species, but he had never encountered anything like this. Most races fought for logical reasons: territory, resources, survival. They retreated when retreat made sense. They surrendered when surrender was rational. But these humans seemed to fight for what? Abstract concepts that could not be measured or calculated. Honor, duty, the lives of strangers they had never met. As Elena finished her latest story, the crowd began to disperse. Zixathara realized he had been sitting in the same spot for over 3 hours, his drink untouched, listening to tales of tactical madness that somehow stirred something deep in his warrior's heart. Elena noticed him watching and raised her glass in his direction. Don't think I've seen you here before, friend. You have the look of someone who's seen some action. Zixathara hesitated. He had not planned to interact with anyone during his brief stop at the station. But something about the old human woman intrigued him. I am Commander Zixathara, he said simply. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Even humans, it seemed, had heard of him. The Zixathara? Well, I'll be damned. What brings the famous Vortha commander to our little watering hole? I was curious about your stories, Zixathara admitted. They are unusual. Elena laughed, a sound that seemed to carry both joy and sorrow. That's one way to put it. Buy me a drink, Commander, and I'll tell you some stories that will really make your head spin. Despite every instinct telling him to return to his ship, Zixathara found himself walking to the bar. Zixathara sat at the bar next to Elena Rodriguez, his clawed hands wrapped around a drink he barely touched. The cantina had grown quieter as the evening progressed, but the human woman showed no signs of running out of stories. Ever hear of a place called Thermopylae? Elena asked, settling back on her stool. Zixathara shook his head. Human history was not something he had studied in detail. His education focused on military tactics and strategic planning across known space, not the ancient wars of primitive planets. Happened on Earth about 2,500 years ago, Elena began. There was this narrow pass between mountains and sea, the only way for a massive Persian army to march south into Greece, and standing in their way were 300 Spartan warriors. 300, Zixathara repeated slowly. Against how many enemies? Historians argue about the exact numbers, but somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Persians, plus their allies. Zixathara's tactical mind immediately calculated the odds. Even if the smaller estimate was correct, that meant each defender faced over 300 enemies. The Spartans retreated? Elena smiled. That's the thing about humans, Commander. Sometimes we're too stubborn to know when we're beaten. King Leonidas, that was the Spartan leader. He looked at those impossible odds and decided his 300 would make their stand right there. That is suicide. Not strategy, Zixathara said flatly. Maybe. But those 300 men held that pass for 3 full days. They killed thousands of Persians, made the whole enemy army fear a handful of warriors with bronze spears and leather shields. Zixathara frowned. What was the strategic purpose? What did they gain by dying? Time, Elena said simply. While Leonidas and his men fought and died at Thermopylae, the rest of Greece prepared for war. The sacrifice of those 300 inspired thousands more to take up arms. In the end, the Greeks won. The logic made some sense, but Zixthera still struggled with the concept. In his experience, commanders who faced impossible odds withdrew to fight another day. Living soldiers were more valuable than dead heroes. Tell me, Elena continued, in all your battles, have you ever fought when victory was impossible? No, Zixthera answered without hesitation. I fight to win. If winning is impossible, I withdraw and find better ground. Smart, Elena nodded. Logical. Exactly what any reasonable commander would do. But humans, we have this problem with logic sometimes. She signaled the bartender for another drink before continuing. During World War II, that was a big conflict on Earth. There was a city called Stalingrad. The enemy surrounded it completely. No supplies could get through. The civilians were starving. The soldiers were outnumbered and outgunned. Every rational analysis said the city would fall. But, Zixthera prompted, though he suspected he knew where this was going. But the defenders decided that some things are more important than survival. They fought for every building, every street, every room. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought with knives. When they ran out of knives, they fought with their bare hands. The battle lasted over 5 months, and they lost the city? They held it, Elena said quietly. Not only held it, but turned the tide of the entire war. The enemy army that attacked Stalingrad was destroyed completely. It was the beginning of the end for them. Zixthera was silent for a long moment. The story defied everything he understood about warfare. You did not win battles by refusing to retreat. You won by superior planning, better resources, tactical advantages. How? He finally asked. Elena shrugged. Nobody knows for sure. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was just human stubbornness. But something happens when humans get pushed to the breaking point. Instead of breaking, we sometimes get stronger. Over the next several hours, Elena told more stories. The Alamo, where 189 Texans held off several thousand Mexican soldiers for 13 days before finally falling. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jewish fighters with stolen weapons and homemade bombs fought the Nazi army for nearly a month, knowing they could not win. Each tale followed the same impossible pattern. Humans faced with overwhelming force choosing to fight rather than surrender, dying in battles that should never have been fought, and somehow these defeats had become the foundation of human military tradition. I don't understand, Zixthera admitted as the cantina began to empty around them. Your species celebrates failure. You honor those who threw away their lives for no strategic gain. Elena was quiet for a moment, staring into her drink. Can I ask you something, Commander? In all your victories, in all those battles you've won, how many of your enemies do you remember? Zixthera considered the question. I remember tactical details, force compositions, weapon capabilities, strategic mistakes. But do you remember their names? Their faces? What they fought for? No. They were obstacles to be removed. Elena nodded slowly. That's the difference between us, I think. When humans fight and die for something bigger than ourselves, we become more than just obstacles. We become legends, stories that inspire others long after we're gone. But you still lose the battles, Zixthera pointed out. Do we? Elena asked. Leonidas died at Thermopylae, but Greece survived. The Alamo fell, but Texas won its independence. The Warsaw fighters were killed, but their example helped bring down an empire. She turned to face him directly. You want to know the real secret, Commander? Sometimes the best way to win a war is to show your enemy that there are things you value more than your own life. When they realize that killing you won't stop you, that dying won't defeat you, that's when they start to fear you. Zixthera's claws tapped against his glass as he processed this. In his millennium of warfare, he had fought enemies who surrendered when defeat became inevitable. He had conquered species who calculated odds and made rational decisions about when to give up. But what did you do with an enemy who refused to be rational? Who fought hardest when they were losing? Who turned defeats into victories through sheer force of will? There's something else, Elena continued. These stories I've been telling you, they're not just history lessons. They're instructions. Instructions for what? For how to be human. Every child on Earth grows up hearing about Thermopylae and the Alamo and Stalingrad. We learn that there are things worth dying for. That courage matters more than survival. That sometimes you have to stand up to impossible odds because it's the right thing to do. Sixthera found this concept even more disturbing than the tactical foolishness. You deliberately teach your young to make irrational decisions in combat? We teach them to make moral decisions, Elena corrected. There's a difference. When you reduce everything to mathematics, to odds and calculations, you lose something essentially human. You lose efficiency, Sixthera countered. Maybe, but you also lose the thing that makes life worth living. What good is survival if you have to abandon everything you believe in to achieve it? The question hung in the air between them. Sixthera had never considered it before. In his culture, survival was the highest virtue. The Vorthok Empire had lasted for millennia because they made practical decisions, because they adapted when necessary, because they never let pride or emotion cloud their judgment. But listening to Elena's stories, he found himself wondering what they had given up in exchange for that longevity. When was the last time the Vorthok had fought for something other than territory or resources? When had they last been willing to die for an abstract principle? I should return to my ship, Sixthera said, though he made no move to leave. Of course, Elena agreed. But maybe tomorrow night you'd like to hear about Rorke's Drift? Or the Battle of Britain? I've got stories that'll really mess with your head, Commander. Despite himself, Sixthera found the prospect intriguing. These human war stories challenged everything he thought he knew about conflict and victory. They were tactically unsound, strategically questionable, and completely fascinating. Perhaps, he said carefully. Elena smiled. Good. Because I have a feeling you're starting to understand something important about humans. We don't fight wars to win them. We fight them to prove who we are. As Sixthera walked back to his ship through the quiet corridors of Crossroad 7, her words echoed in his mind. For the first time in his long military career, he found himself questioning not just how to fight, but why. Sixthera returned to the cantina the next evening, though he told himself it was merely to pass time while his ship underwent routine maintenance. Elena Rodriguez was already at the bar, chatting with the four-armed bartender about trade routes and cargo prices. She looked up when he approached. Figured you'd be back, she said with a knowing smile. Once someone starts hearing human war stories, they can't seem to stop. Sixthera took his seat from the previous night. I have been thinking about what you said, about fighting to prove who you are rather than to achieve victory. And it makes no logical sense. Wars are fought for resources, territory, survival. Personal identity is irrelevant to strategic outcomes. Elena chuckled. You sound like every military academy textbook ever written. All very neat and tidy. But let me ask you something. In all your battles, did you ever fight alongside soldiers who were there just for the paycheck? And others who believed in the cause? Sixthera considered this. Yes, some fought because it was their duty. Others fought for glory or advancement. A few seemed to fight for personal reasons I did not understand. Which ones fought better? The answer came without hesitation. Those with personal investment in the outcome. They took greater risks, showed more initiative, fought longer when wounded. Exactly. Now imagine an entire species that fights like that. Not for pay or promotion or conquest, but because losing would mean abandoning everything they believe makes them worth being. Before Sixthera could respond, Elena launched into another story. Ever hear of a place called Rorke's Drift? He shook his head, settling in for what he was beginning to recognize as another lesson in human military madness. 1879, on Earth. British colony in South Africa. A small mission station defended by about 150 soldiers, mostly sick or wounded. They get word that 4,000 Zulu warriors are coming their way, fresh from destroying a much larger British force earlier that day. Sixthera's tactical mind immediately began calculating. Odds of approximately 27-1. Defenders should evacuate immediately. That's what any sensible commander would do, Elena agreed. But Lieutenant Chard and Lieutenant Bromhead decided to make their stand. They had wounded men who couldn't be moved. They had civilians to protect. And maybe, just maybe, they could buy time for reinforcements. They died, of course. That's the thing, Elena said, taking a sip of her drink. They didn't. They held that mission station for 2 straight days against wave after wave of attacks. Used everything they could find, furniture, bags of grain, even books, to build barricades. When they ran low on ammunition, they fought with bayonets. When the roof caught fire, they kept fighting while putting out the flames. Sixthera frowned. The Zulu withdrew? Eventually. After losing hundreds of warriors to a handful of defenders, they decided easier targets existed elsewhere. 11 of the defenders were awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor in the British military. But what did they achieve? You said they were buying time for reinforcements that never came. They protected wounded soldiers and civilians who could have been evacuated. The strategic value was minimal. Elena studied him for a moment. You really don't see it, do you? They proved that a small group of determined humans could stand against impossible odds and win. Not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. Over the following nights, Elena continued her education of the Vorthak commander. She told him about the Battle of Britain, where outnumbered pilots flew mission after mission against a larger air force, literally saving their civilization. About Bastogne, where American paratroopers held a surrounded town through the worst winter in decades, telling the Germans, nuts, when offered a chance to surrender. Each story chipped away at Zixthara's certainty about the nature of warfare. He began to understand that humans fought differently than any species he had encountered. They seemed to grow stronger under pressure, more determined when facing defeat, more creative when conventional tactics failed. It's not that we enjoy losing, Elena explained during their 5th evening together. It's that we refuse to let losing define us. When humans get backed into a corner, something happens. We stop thinking about survival and start thinking about legacy. Legacy? What we leave behind. What story gets told about us after we're gone? Would you rather be remembered as the commander who made the smart tactical decision and lived to fight another day, or the one who stood when standing was impossible? Zixthara was quiet for a long moment. In Vorthak culture, the greatest honor went to those who achieved victory through superior planning and execution. Heroes were those who conquered enemies and claimed territory for the empire. Living heroes were always preferred to dead ones. Your species values the dramatic gesture over practical results, he said finally. Sometimes, but here's the thing you're missing, Commander. Those dramatic gestures have practical results. When word spreads that humans will fight to the death rather than surrender, enemies start thinking twice about attacking us. When they know that every battle will cost them far more than it should, they start looking for easier targets. Elena leaned forward, her voice growing serious. Do you know why the Zephyrian Collective agreed to peace terms after our first contact war? It wasn't because we had better ships or more soldiers. It was because they realized that conquering humanity would cost them more than leaving us alone. Every human colony would fight like Thermopylae. Every ship would ram rather than surrender. Every soldier would make them pay for every meter of ground. The logic was beginning to make sense to Zixthara, though it challenged everything he had learned about warfare. You make yourselves too expensive to conquer. Exactly. And the reputation spreads. Other species hear the stories and think, maybe we don't want to fight these crazy humans after all. It's the most effective deterrent in the galaxy, not the threat of retaliation, but the promise that victory will cost more than defeat. That night, alone in his quarters aboard his ship, Zixthara found himself reviewing his own military career with new eyes. His victories had been clean, efficient, decisive. Minimal casualties, maximum strategic gain, perfect execution of carefully calculated plans, the Vorthak way. But what had those victories accomplished? Territory conquered, resources claimed, enemies defeated, all temporary gains that could be lost as easily as they were won. Had any of his battles created lasting change? Had any of his victories become stories that inspired others? He thought about his most famous engagement, the Battle of Kepler 442. Outnumbered 3-2 by a coalition fleet, he had used superior positioning and timing to achieve total victory with minimal losses. It was studied at military academies across the galaxy as an example of perfect tactical execution. But what had it meant? The territory he had won was later traded away in a peace treaty. The enemy forces he had destroyed were quickly replaced. Within 5 years, it was as if the battle had never happened. Efficient, yes. Memorable? Hardly. Elena's stories, by contrast, had happened thousands of years ago and were still being told. Still inspiring new generations of humans to stand against impossible odds. Still shaping how an entire species understood courage and sacrifice. Maybe there was something to be said for the human approach after all. The next evening, Zixthara arrived at the cantina to find Elena in conversation with a young Centauri trader who looked deeply troubled. The syndicate is demanding protection money, the trader was saying. Either I pay or they destroy my cargo and probably my ship too. I don't have enough credits to pay, but I also can't afford to fight them. How many ships? Elena asked. 3 cruisers. My freighter has basic shields and maybe 2 functioning weapons. It would be suicide to resist. Zixthera expected Elena to offer sympathy and suggest the trader find another route. Instead, she smiled. "Let me tell you about the Kobayashi Maru," she said. "It's a training scenario from Starfleet Academy. Fictional, but based on real situations humans face all the time. No-win scenarios where every choice leads to disaster." The young Centauri leaned forward eagerly. "The point isn't to win," Elena continued. "The point is to find out who you are when winning is impossible. Do you surrender and live with the shame? Do you fight and die with honor? Or do you find a third option that nobody else saw coming?" She turned to include Zixithera in the conversation. "Sometimes the most important victories happen when you refuse to accept the limitations other people try to impose on you." As Elena began telling the story of a human freighter captain who had defeated 3 pirate vessels using nothing but cargo, containers, and creative thinking, Zixithera found himself wondering if he had been fighting the wrong kind of wars his entire life. On the 7th night, Elena Rodriguez did something unexpected. Instead of launching into another historical tale, she ordered 2 strong drinks and pushed one across the bar to Zixithera. "I think it's time I told you about my own war," she said quietly. Zixithera had been wondering about Elena's personal military experience. Her knowledge of tactics and her understanding of combat psychology suggested real battlefield experience, not just academic study. He waited for her to continue. "First Contact War, 2387. I was a lieutenant aboard the UES Defiant, part of the Colonial Defense Fleet. We were exploring new systems when we ran into the Zephyrian Collective." Elena's voice grew distant. They had been expanding for centuries, absorbing or destroying every species they encountered. When they met humans for the first time, they made the same assumption everyone makes: that humans would be easily defeated, that we would be rational, that when faced with overwhelming force, we would surrender or negotiate. The Zephyrian commander sent a message to our colonial headquarters: "Submit to incorporation into the collective or be destroyed." Standard procedure for them. Elena took a long drink before continuing. "The colonies voted to fight, not because we thought we could win. Our entire fleet was maybe 1,000 ships against their 50,000, but because the alternative was becoming part of a machine that had crushed 100 other species." Zixthera did quick calculations in his head. 50-1 odds were beyond hopeless. "Your commanders should have negotiated terms, preserved what they could." "Should have, yes, but you're missing something important about humans, Commander. We have this stubborn idea that some things are worth dying for: freedom, independence, the right to choose our own path, even if it leads to extinction." Elena activated a small holographic projector, showing tactical displays from her ship's records. Zixithera watched with professional interest as the images showed human vessels facing overwhelming odds. "This was the Battle of New Geneva," Elena narrated. 12 human destroyers against 3 Zephyrian battle groups. We knew we couldn't win, but we also knew that every minute we held them here was another minute for the civilians to evacuate. The hologram showed what should have been a massacre. The human ships were outgunned, outnumbered, and tactically outmaneuvered, but they fought with a ferocity that surprised Zixthera. Ships continued attacking even after taking critical damage. Crews kept firing weapons right up until their vessels exploded. "Watch this," Elena said, highlighting one particular ship. The destroyer Birmingham, Captain Sarah Chen commanding. Hull breached in 17 places, reactor destabilizing, half her crew dead. Any rational commander would surrender. Zixthera watched as the crippled human ship turned toward the largest Zephyrian vessel and began accelerating. She rammed a battle cruiser, he observed, at near light speed, took out their flagship and 2 escort vessels. Captain Chen and her remaining crew bought us another hour with that maneuver. The tactical part of Zixthera's mind was appalled. Trading a destroyer for a battle cruiser was mathematically favorable, but the ramming attack had been unnecessary. The Birmingham could have continued fighting from range, possibly inflicting more total damage before being destroyed. "Inefficient," he said. Elena smiled grimly. That's what the Zephyrians thought at first. They calculated that at current rates of exchange, they would eliminate the human fleet within 6 weeks while losing perhaps 10% of their own forces. acceptable casualties for a conquest. But humans don't fight the way their computers predicted. We don't retreat when we should. We don't surrender when it's logical. We don't preserve forces for future battles when people are dying right now. The hologram shifted to show a larger engagement. Dozens of ships locked in combat across a vast area of space. But Zixthara noticed something strange about the human tactical formations. Your ships are protecting the damaged vessels instead of abandoning them, he observed. We don't leave anyone behind. Ever. If a ship is crippled, the rest of the fleet forms a defensive screen around it. If life pods are launched, someone always stays to pick them up, no matter how dangerous the situation. That is tactically unsound. Damaged ships should be abandoned to preserve combat effectiveness. Maybe. But it means our crews fight harder, knowing they won't be left to die. And it means the enemy has to destroy every single ship completely. They can't just disable us and move on. Elena called up more combat footage. Human fighters ramming Zephyrian capital ships. Ground troops holding impossible positions. Entire colonies choosing destruction over surrender. This is from Hadley's Hope, Elena said, showing orbital bombardment footage. 15,000 colonists. The Zephyrians offered to spare them in exchange for information about our fleet positions. The colonists voted to fight. They all died. Every last one. But they took 30,000 Zephyrian ground troops with them, and they transmitted everything they learned about enemy tactics to our remaining forces before the end. Zixthara was beginning to understand the pattern. Individual human actions made no tactical sense, but the cumulative effect was devastating to enemy morale and planning. How do you fight an enemy that refuses to be rational? Show me more, he requested. Over the next 2 hours, Elena shared combat recordings from the 2-year war. Humans fighting in zero gravity with jury-rigged weapons, colony ships ramming enemy dreadnoughts, civilians joining military units when their worlds were invaded. One recording particularly struck Zixthara. It showed a human marine unit trapped in an underground bunker, completely surrounded, low on ammunition and supplies. Final transmission from Firebase Charlie, Elena explained. 43 Marines against a full Zephyrian assault division. They held out for 6 days. In the recording, a young sergeant spoke into his communicator. This is Sergeant Martinez, Firebase Charlie. We're down to our last clips and our last rations, but we're still here, still fighting. If anyone receives this, know that we held the line. Know that we proved humans don't break. Tell our families we died free. The transmission ended as the bunker was overrun. What was the strategic value of that position? Zixthara asked. None. It was already bypassed by the main enemy advance. Those Marines could have surrendered and lived. Then why fight? Elena looked at him seriously. Because that's who we are. Because those 43 Marines knew that somewhere, other humans would hear their story. Would understand that we don't give up, even when giving up is the smart thing to do. She switched to a different recording, this one showing a massive space battle. Thousands of ships engaged across light minutes of space. Final battle of the war, Elena said. The Zephyrians brought their entire remaining fleet to Earth. We had maybe 300 ships left. They had over 10,000. Zixthara watched the hopeless battle unfold. Human ships fighting with desperate courage, throwing themselves at enemy formations with no regard for survival. It was magnificent and terrible and completely insane. How did it end? The Zephyrian fleet commander opened a communication channel, said he wanted to discuss terms, not our surrender. A ceasefire. This surprised Zixthara. They were winning decisively. They were. But they had been fighting humans for 2 years, and they were starting to understand something. Even if they destroyed every human ship, conquered every human world, killed every human soldier, they still wouldn't win, because humans would keep fighting. Our children would grow up planning rebellion. Our elderly would sabotage enemy equipment. Every victory would cost them more than defeat. Elena finished her drink. The Zephyrian commander said something I'll never forget. Your species is not rational. You fight wars you cannot win for reasons we cannot understand. Conquering you would destroy us both. So they withdrew. They offered a treaty. Mutual non-aggression, defined territorial boundaries, trade agreements. They would leave us alone if we promised not to expand into their space. And your leaders agreed? Elena smiled. Of course not. We demanded territory as compensation for the colonies they had destroyed. War reparations. Formal recognition of human sovereignty. Everything a defeated power should never be able to demand. Impossible. That's what the Zephyrians thought. But they had learned something about humans during those 2 years. When we say we'll fight to the death, we mean it literally. They could defeat us, but they couldn't conquer us. And they were tired of losing ships to enemies who fought like demons and died like heroes. So they accepted your terms? Most of them. The treaty established humanity as a recognized power in this sector of the galaxy. All because we were too stubborn to know when we were beaten. Zixathera sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything he had seen and heard. The human approach to warfare violated every principle he had learned in his millennium of military service. It was wasteful, emotional, tactically unsound, and strategically questionable. It was also, he was beginning to realize, devastatingly, effective in ways that traditional military theory could not explain. The emergency message arrived during their 8th evening together. Zixathera was listening to Elena describe the Warsaw Uprising when his personal communicator chimed with the highest priority signal. The holographic display showed the seal of the Vorthak High Command, and the message was brief and terrifying. Commander Zixathera, return to Vorthak Prime immediately. Our home system is under attack by unknown mechanical forces. Enemy numbers estimated at 10,000 combat units. Our defensive fleet numbers less than 800 ships. Your tactical expertise is required. Situation critical. Elena read the message over his shoulder. Mechanical forces? The convergence, Zixathera said grimly. Machine intelligences from beyond the galactic rim. They have been moving through unexplored space, converting matter into more machines. We knew they existed, but thought they would take centuries to reach our sector. He stood quickly, his mind already calculating travel time to his home system. I must go. My people. I know, Elena said quietly. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn book bound in leather. Take this with you. Zixathera looked at the title. Human Military History. Battles Against Impossible Odds. The cover was scarred and stained. Clearly having been read many times, this is from Earth, my grandfather's copy. He carried it through 3 wars. My father took it to the Centauri campaign. I had it with me during the Zephyrian conflict. Elena pressed the book into his clawed hands. Maybe it's time someone else learned what we know about fighting when fighting is hopeless. Elena, Zixathera started, then stopped. He had never struggled to find words before. Go, she said simply. But remember what I told you. Sometimes the most important victories happen in defeat. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. Zixathera's ship made the journey to Vorthak Prime in record time, but he arrived to find his worst fears confirmed. The convergence had already engaged the outer defense fleet. The mechanical ships were unlike anything in his tactical databases, geometric forms that reconfigured themselves during battle, adapting to whatever weapons were used against them. High Admiral Kethvar briefed him aboard the command station orbiting their homeworld. We have lost 40% of our forces in 3 days. Their ships learn from every engagement. Weapons that work once become useless in the next battle. Zixathera studied the tactical displays with growing unease. The convergence fought with perfect efficiency, making no mistakes, wasting no resources. Their formations were mathematically optimal. Their targeting priorities were flawlessly logical. It was like fighting against his own tactical philosophy made manifest. Recommendations? Kethvar asked. Withdraw the fleet, Zixathera said without hesitation. Establish defensive positions in the outer system. Force them to come to us on ground of our choosing. Impossible. They have already begun bombardment of the outer colonies. 3 million civilians on Vorthak 7 alone. Zixathera's tactical mind calculated the exchange rate. 3 million civilians against the surviving ships of the defense fleet. Mathematically, the ships were more valuable. They could be used to defend other worlds, fight other battles. The civilians were already lost, but as he prepared to voice this analysis, Elena's words echoed in his memory. Sometimes you have to stand up to impossible odds because it's the right thing to do. What do you propose instead? He asked. A direct assault on their main force. Drive them away from the colonies before they can complete their bombardment. It was suicide. The convergence ships would adapt to whatever tactics they used. The Vorthak fleet would be destroyed piecemeal, achieving nothing except their own annihilation. Zixthera opened Elena's book and found himself looking at a picture of 300 Spartan warriors standing in a narrow mountain pass. Below it was a quote, "Then we will fight in the shade. Assemble the fleet," he said suddenly. Kethvar looked surprised. "You have a strategy?" "No," Zixthera admitted. "But I have something else. Prepare for full assault. All ships, maximum attack formation." 2 hours later, the remaining Vorthak fleet moved into battle formation against impossible odds. Zixthera stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the geometric forms of the convergence vessels on the main display. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the enemy is adapting their formations to counter our approach. They are positioning for optimal defensive fire." Of course they were. The machines fought exactly as Zixthera himself would have fought, efficiently, logically, without emotion or waste. But Elena had taught him something about the value of the irrational choice. "All ships," he broadcast on the fleet communication channel. "This is Commander Zixthera. The enemy has superior numbers and adaptive technology. By every tactical analysis, we cannot win this engagement." He paused, feeling the weight of 1,000 battles, a millennium of victories achieved through careful calculation. "But today, we do not fight to win. Today we fight to prove that some things matter more than survival. We fight for the 3 million souls on Vorthak 7 who are counting on us. We fight to show the universe that the Vorthak Empire does not abandon its people. We fight because it is who we choose to be." The fleet moved forward as one. The first exchange of fire went exactly as predicted. Convergence weapons tore through Vorthak shields with mechanical precision. Ships began dying within minutes of engagement. But something unexpected happened. Instead of falling back to regroup, the damaged vessels pressed their attacks. Instead of preserving forces for later battles, commanders threw everything they had at the enemy formations. "Sir," the tactical officer called out, "the Vengeance is on a collision course with the enemy flagship. Captain Mordan is not responding to communications." Zixthera watched as the heavy cruiser, its hull breached in dozen places, rammed into the largest convergence vessel. Both ships vanished in a sphere of nuclear fire. "Honor Guard reports critical damage but refuses to withdraw," another officer announced. "Captain Zilith says she still has weapons and there are still enemies to fight." Across the battle space, Vorthak ships fought with a ferocity that seemed to confuse the convergence forces. The machines had calculated optimal responses to logical tactics, but they had not programmed responses to enemies who fought harder when losing, who increased their aggression as their situation became more hopeless. "Enemy formation is breaking up," the sensor officer reported with surprise. "Several of their ships are withdrawing from optimal firing positions." Zixthera understood what was happening. The convergence had been designed to fight rational enemies who would retreat when defeat became inevitable. They had no protocols for dealing with opponents who became more dangerous as they took damage, who fought hardest when they were dying. As his own ship shuddered under enemy fire, Zixthera found himself thinking of Leonidas at Thermopylae, of the defenders of the Alamo, of Captain Elena Rodriguez telling stories in a cantina on Crossroads 7. "All remaining ships," he broadcast, "follow me." He led the surviving vessels in a direct charge at the heart of the convergence formation. It was tactically insane, strategically pointless, and completely human in its magnificent futility. The convergence flagship tried to adapt its defenses, but it had been programmed to expect rational opponents. When faced with enemies who would rather die fighting than live in defeat, its logical algorithms began to falter. Zixthera's ship took hit after hit, but he kept pressing forward. Around him, the last ships of the Vorthak fleet fought with desperate courage, proving that mathematics could not account for the strength found in hopeless causes. As his bridge filled with smoke and his systems failed one by one, Zixthera opened Elena's book to a random page. The words seemed to glow in the emergency lighting. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear," Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand when everyone else has fallen. The Convergence flagship loomed ahead, its weapons charging for a final salvo. Zixathara's ship had no shields left, no functioning weapons, no hope of survival. But he had learned something from human war stories. Sometimes defeat teaches victory what it really means. For Vorthak, he roared, pushing his engines to maximum power. As his ship entered its final ramming attack, Zixathara felt something he had never experienced in 1,000 battles. The strange peace that comes from fighting not to win, but to prove that some things are worth dying for. The impact destroyed both vessels, but the psychological effect rippled through the Convergence fleet. Faced with enemies who fought like demons and died like heroes, the machine intelligences calculated that conquering this system would cost more than it was worth. The surviving Convergence vessels withdrew beyond the Galactic Rim, leaving behind a battered but victorious Vorthak fleet. In the cantina on Crossroads 7, Elena Rodriguez raised a glass to the empty stool beside her. "Here's to learning what it means to fight like a human," she said quietly, and drank to the memory of a reptilian warrior who had discovered that the heart of courage beats the same in every brave soul, regardless of species. The story of Zixathara's last battle became legend throughout the galaxy, proving once again that sometimes the most important victories are won by those who refuse to accept defeat.